Two. Thanks for your patience.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can I have your attention, please? My name is Hal Roth. I direct the Contemplative Studies Initiative and Concentration. And I'd like to welcome you to a jointly sponsored lecture by Professor Sienna Craig of Dartmouth College. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Department of Anthropology, the Center for Contemporary South Asia, and the Contemplative Studies Concentration and Initiative. This is a very unusual type of situation. I mean, it feels very much like a live broadcast, and it kind of reminds me back a long, long time ago when I was a teenager. I was a classical pianist, and I performed every month on live television in the capital cities area around Albany. And the situation of a live broadcast kind of reminds me of that. It was a little unnerving because I was on a variety show, and there would be a chorus line of a 10-year-olds tap dancing and somebody doing a lip sync, and then the director would come over with the camera and then go boom, and there I was, live television. And here, once again, how many years later, we're doing it. So I'd like to welcome everybody here in the room and wherever you are to this lecture. Particular thanks goes to the chair of anthropology, Professor Jessa Leineweaver, to Elena Suplita in anthropology, and to Parker Van Valkenburg, also to Ashutosh Varney and Stephanie Abbott from the Center for Contemporary South Asia, and my longtime friend, former TA and colleague, the administrator for contemplative studies, Ann Heyrman-Hart, whose work is always appreciated. I'd like to begin with a statement that we're working on, call it a statement that's in flux about Aboriginal rights and the land that we occupy here at Brown. So this is just a statement for contemplative studies, and we will also defer to what the university decides will be their official statement when that happens. But as a provisional statement, we would like to recognize that Brown University occupies Aboriginal lands of the First Nations of Southern New England. We honor these peoples and their cultures, and we are actively exploring ways to bring their valuable epistemologies into our curriculum. Just like those of the Nepali and Tibetan peoples about whom you will hear today, they have much to contribute to our world at this crucial point in human history. So, contemplative studies, just briefly, is a relatively new concentration. We're very much interested in what you might call the experience, the practices and experiences that lead to self-knowledge that are found in the traditional cultures of East and South Asia, and really all over the world. We're also exploring indigenous cultures, working on courses for that as well. And we look at human contemplative experience, which is a very, very important subset of human experience. These are experiences of profound focus and concentration that open up insights into the nature of self, the nature of the context in which the self arises, and both social and political and also environmental contexts. And we study those from a kind of traditional third person at a distance perspective, but also what we call critical first person perspectives, in which we actually teach in classroom settings the contemplative practices that we are studying. In some ways, I think, given my little knowledge of anthropology, that this kind of parallels the distinction between etic and emic perspectives that anthropologists follow. And it's something that I've always admired about anthropology from a distance is that the emic perspectives are ones that are fully embraced. And we try to do that with our critical first person perspectives. I'd like to introduce, by the way, just if you would like more information, please go to our website. We have a speaker series coming up, some virtual, some in person, focused this fall on Zen and the West. And we will start with an Indigenous Peoples Day seminar by David Loy. It's a Buddhist philosopher on the topic of racism as delusion, a Buddhist perspective. That will be on October 11th from 7 to 8:30. There'll be a short pre-distributed paper on that topic. And we have 4 other lectures coming up. So please go to our website and have a look. One of the great privileges of teaching at Brown, and those of you who teach here know that this is absolutely the case, is the wonderful students that one has an opportunity to teach and perhaps in some small way to influence. And it was my great pleasure 20 some years ago to find Sienna Craig in I think the introduction to East Asian Buddhism, or maybe Foundations of Chinese Religion class. Every so often there's a student who impresses you with not only their intellect, but their heart. And they're so impressive that they're kind of like forces of nature. And all you can do is kind of give them what you know and not stand in the way. And Sienna is one of those rare students. Srinivas Reddy is another one. And Chloe Zimmerman is another one. And Larson DiFiore is another one. That's what I mean by being privileged. So Sienna finished her bachelor's degree here. So I was the undergraduate advisor in religious studies when I approved Sienna going for 1 semester on the School for International Training to Nepal. And she came back really absolutely fascinated with the traditional veterinary medicine of Mustang province. And that then grew into her graduate work at Cornell in anthropology, and has grown into this amazing, I mean, CV. Sienna's very modest, but you know, I chaired the tenure promotion appointments committee a while ago, and we often kind of like weigh up the scholarly publications, 43 articles, 22 book chapters, 6 books, and grants. Whoa, I didn't know social scientists could get grants like that. Wow, very, very impressive. Really, Sienna's work is not just impressive in terms of publications, but it's what she works on and how she works at the interface between medicine, religion, and culture. Rooted deeply in medical and cultural anthropology, but with enduring commitments to studying religion, as well as the creative work. She also is a poet, which I actually didn't know, published poet. And very much interested in community outreach and bringing the knowledge that she has developed in her research out into the larger world. And the research is not just brilliant intellectually, but it has such heart. And that's also incredibly important. So it is with humility and with great pride that I introduce Professor Sienna Craig.
Thank you, Hal. It's really a great privilege to be here. It's so special to be in this room for so many reasons. I so I owe so much to this place, to Hal. I didn't know really much about Brown at all when a recruiter and Brown admissions officer had a half an hour to kill between two private schools in Southern California, and he swung by my public high school and he told me about this place, and I thought, that sounds really cool. That sounds like a place I could probably find a sense of home and belonging. And indeed it was. That was many, many years ago now. And I also felt that same way in a different sense when I walked into the Foundations of Chinese Religions, my second semester here at Brown. So it's really, really special to be back here with all of you. This is the first time that I have given a talk like this in many, many, many months. And I imagine for some of you, it's the first time that you're sitting in a room hearing a talk like this. So also just to acknowledge that we're still in this rather funny space, trying to figure out how to be with each other safely and in community. So those of you in the Zoomiverse, those of you here in person, I'm really, really glad to be here. With gratitude to everyone that Hal has already named, anthropology and contemplative studies. I had the great privilege of spending this morning with some undergraduate students who are writing their senior theses in anthropology and related disciplines, and also and it's nice to see some of them here, and also graduate students in the department. And what we did is we thought and we wrote together. And we tried to think with and through poetry, actually, as a prompt for ethnographic writing. And we also tried to be attuned to the things that unexpectedly connect across time and across space, across forms of the written word. And to think together, really, and it was a privilege to do that as well. So the stories that I'm going to be sharing today, the talk that I'm going to be giving, is based on a book that came out just about a year ago. And I did a bunch of virtual events when it first came out, but again, this is a first to actually get a chance to talk about this project live and in person after many, many years of it being in the making. Hal talked a little bit about the beginnings of my time here, but I just wanted to call out in image and in word, again, some of the origin stories and the journeys that make this book possible. The beginning of the story really did start in Hal's Chinese religions class, in the sense that it was an opportunity to begin to think cross-culturally, even though that wasn't necessarily how a religious studies class was pedagogically framed. It was very much what was going on in that classroom, and to think with humility and creativity about ways of being in the world that extend far beyond one's direct or immediate experience. This sustained me as I went off. That's me at 19 when I was a junior here, and I went off to Nepal for my first semester. And these are me with some of my Brown roommates who are still some of my best friends, and me with my daughter, my fictive sister, her daughter, very recently in Queens, New York. So this is a way of saying that this book, the stories that are contained within it, and the research that undergirds it, are structuring 28 years, almost 30 years of relationship, friendship, as well as research. The work on which this book is based emerges both from New York City and Nepal, and some places in between. And it's work that's grown out of a few different research projects. So the field work that undergirds the stories in this text come from work that I've done with a biological anthropology colleague on women's reproductive histories and Tibetan adaptations to altitude. It's come out of other work that I've done collaboratively on education and outmigration from the northern Himalayan stretch, really, to parts of urban Nepal, but also beyond to places like New York. And it's also come out of work that I've done on everyday religion and well-being in the context of immigrant life in New York City. So how in a 14 or 15-hour day at a nail salon do you find space and time for Buddhist practice? What does that do to your experience as an immigrant in this country? How do the mechanisms for living that travel with you get recreated or get challenged in the context of migration? I've spent a lot of my sort of middle career working with Tibetan physicians. And in fact, my connection to horses was also a connection to Tibetan doctors. So the person who's up there next to me, he's actually on the cover of my second book, Healing Elements, but he's a Tibetan physician, also knew a ton about horses. And I lived with him and his wife and family during that first semester when I was away from Brown. And to this day, he and others like him retain a very important part in my life and in my research. I work closely with his son now, who's also a Tibetan physician. And then finally, some of the other research that undergirds what I'm going to share today comes from other forms of collaboration with linguists and with community organizations, particularly in New York City. Parker and I share a connection to someone named Ross Perlin, who's one of the co-directors of the Endangered Language Alliance, which is an organization in New York that's dedicated to the recognition, revitalization, and documentation of the diversity of languages in New York City. Some of the places that you'll be hearing about today, neighborhoods like Jackson Heights in Queens, for instance, is one of the most linguistically diverse regions in the world and the most linguistically diverse zip code in all of the United States. And so I've worked with ELA, which is this organization's acronym, as well as with community researchers and organizers to try to document within that the diversity of Himalayan and Tibetan languages in New York. And so all of these different pieces, in a sense, as well as some ongoing work related to Himalayan and Tibetan New Yorker responses to COVID, which I'll talk about at the very end, and I'm happy to answer questions about, are the sort of research foundations that have gone into this text, which is a text that involves storytelling across fiction and narrative ethnography. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and read in a bit as well. But this book is dedicated to this person. Jigme Dorji Palbarbista was the 25th king of Lo. Lo is the region of Mustang, culturally Tibetan area in northern Nepal on the border with Tibet. He and his descendants came from the Gungtang region of western central Tibet, and his kingship dates back to the 14th century. He's somebody who I feel very privileged to have known over the course of about 2 decades, and who carried his culture through massive transitions through the 20th and the 21st century. But this book is also about relationships and connections across many generations. And many of us in anthropology will talk about key informants. There's something both I think strong and limiting about that formation in terms of the people that we are working with. I like to think about these individuals as core relationships that actually structure what I know, that co-produce what it is that comes out in a form like this, or in a form of perhaps a co-authored article or a film. And so there are 4 core relationships, and you'll meet a couple of them in the course of this talk, that also structure this book. They're essentially the people without whom this book would not be. And of those 4, 2 are back in Nepal still at this point, and 2 live in New York City. So again, to give you a sense of sort of the ways that the people and culture are moving through this work. This is a story about migration, diaspora, and social change across time and space. But it's also an effort to theory build, to do concept work in anthropology with Tibetan and Himalayan concepts. And it's an approach to anthropological writing that, as I mentioned before, combines different ways of storytelling, different modes, fiction and narrative ethnography. And part of this is because I'm trying to let, as we were talking about this morning, storytelling do the conceptual work of what is the point? Why am I telling you this about this element of migration or social change? I'd like to just situate you briefly sort of in time and space. This is a picture of Lomanthang, which is the walled city in northern Mustang district, Nepal. I'll show you a map in a second, where much of this work sort of springs from. Mustang is located in the rain shadow of the Himalayas, so that's why it looks quite dry. It's flanked essentially by Dhaulagiri Massif, which is Dhaulagiri is the seventh tallest mountain in the Himalayan range, and then the Annapurnas on the other side. The Kali Gandaki River runs like a spine really through this land. It's a conduit for cultural and economic exchange, and it has been so for centuries. Salt for grain, but also different forms of Buddhist practice connected to the Hindu lowlands, and many other dynamic relationships. It's a place where Buddhism, as well as the pre-Buddhist Tibetan religions, often called Bon, are practiced still today. And it's also a place where many different kinds of cultural, social, and political influences are at play. Lo Montang literally means plain of aspiration. And you can kind of feel that in this picture. It's a walled city. It's a space that earlier kings from central Western Tibet sort of discovered and thought, oh, you know, this would be a really good place to build a micro empire, if you will. It's very well situated politically, but it also now lies on a very sensitive geopolitical border. It is a place that in more recent years has become politicized in a range of ways. So from 1960 to 1974, the Khampa, or the Tibetan Resistance Army, was based in Mustang. So people fighting the Chinese, fighting the People's Liberation Army were based here. They were funded by the CIA. Not a fact that is often talked about, but I think an important part of this story. Fast forwarding for some years and decades, this region was then, after the Khampas left, closed to foreigners, in great part because of its sensitive border nature. And so it wasn't until 1992 that foreigners were able to go to this region. I first went there in 1993. It is, from that point on, kind of a place that has come to embody this idea of Tibetanness in Nepal, of being a little Tibet, if you will. Well, going to Tibet proper was politically, and still remains politically, very challenging. But it is also a place that, because it's aligned so much historically, politically, culturally, linguistically with Tibet, it has a kind of love-hate relationship with the nation state of Nepal. And the Nepalese government has treated this area with, by turns, marginalization, exoticization, and different forms of trouble or disdain. These days, it's also become important because uranium has been found in a lot of these areas. And so as a road, a motorable road, has been built through Mustang, one of the other sort of specters that is now looming is the ongoing proximate relationship with China, between China and Nepal, as Nepal figures into geopolitics between China and India. And all of this, again, is playing out on ecologically very sensitive terrain. Mustang, like many parts of the Himalaya, has been massively affected already by climate change. The roof of the world is also known as the third pole. And so many of the stories and the communities, the villages that I've spent time in are now very directly threatened by climate change, massive glacial flooding, the drying up of water sources. So all of this is sort of playing out quite literally across the plane of aspiration. This is a picture from another angle of Lomanthang at daybreak. And it's a picture of the path that the king of Mustang and others would walk every morning and every evening, doing what is called kora. Kora is circumambulation. It's walking around in order to make peace with. It's a way of marking the beginnings and the ends of a day. It's a space for Buddhist meditative practice, for, if you will, walking meditation. But it's also a way of feeling a sense of home and belonging, and literally circumscribing your territory. what place you call home. And I show this picture for a number of reasons, one of which is this idea of Kora, I'll come back to in a moment, but is a kind of driving principle. It's one of these concepts that I think with as I think about the circles and cycles of migration. Further south from Lumantang is Jomsom, the district headquarters of Mustang. And this is a picture of actually Tsampanawang, the doctor who was in that first slide, of his old hotel, the Dancing Yak Lodge, where I spent a lot of time. And what you see in this picture is something of the kind of almost Wild West demeanor of parts of Mustang. Mustang is a place still that is very much at a crossroads of culture, history, politics. It's a place that since it opened in 1992 has become very important to Nepal for tourism. And it's a place where tradition and modernity very much meet, mingle, argue with each other, use each other for their own purposes in very interesting ways. Horses sit next to motorcycles. Tibetan script sits next to Yak Donalds. And this image actually is, I don't know how well you can see the details with the lights on, but the image on the right is actually a painting done by a really wonderful contemporary Nepali woman artist. But it's a very sort of photorealist image of a lot of the tourist signs in Mustang. So Illy Coffee and the Romeo and Juliet Lodge and restaurant, and all of these things. Mustang, it becomes a space in which ideas of authenticity and expectations of the other are very much reflected and refracted back on each other in real time. Jomsom is also where the airport is. It's where now a motorable road strings through. And it's a place where you can see Mustang operating as a space where animal husbandry, seasonal trade, tourism, now even apples are a major export from Mustang, all coexist. And it's a place also that has been one hub or one stopping point really in situations and cycles of migration. So it's important to note that people from Mustang, although they might look in what seems to be a remote or an out of the way place, really have been moving regionally and even globally for quite some time. So they've done this for seasonal trade and migration to India, to North India. Starting in the 80s, many of the men began to go to do contract labor in Korea and Japan, working in places like chicken factories or water bottling plants or places that make fake, pleather jackets. And they would spend 3 or 4 years there, earn money, and then return back home. And this was sort of the way or one cycle of migration and mobility, social and economic mobility that existed through the late 80s or early 1990s in Mustang. But starting in the late 90s and continuing to this day, things began to change. And the dynamics of migration, for many reasons, push-pull factors, including a civil war in Nepal, continued from 1996 to 2006, continued political marginalization of culturally Tibetan people as Nepal continued to feel the pressure to be beholden to the One China policy, to many other kinds of dynamics that are much more personal or aspirational. The idea that one ought go out and migrate for a period to earn cash, to bring back, to uplift the family, or to pay for school fees, or to pay for medicine, or what have you. The remittance economy kind of got going. But in the late 90s, there were a bunch of convergences that facilitated the more permanent beginnings of more permanent movement of people from Mustang to New York. And so for those of you who don't know New York, this is a picture of Roosevelt Avenue in Queens, essentially a part of Jackson Heights. And you can see here, there's a Colombian bakery next to Spicy Tibet, next to the variety and gift stores owned by a Bangladeshi family, next to another ethnic group store right down the road. So Himalayan and Tibetan New Yorkers are obviously one small part of a very, very large and dynamic experience of neighborly diversity in a place like New York. this little inset, again, I don't know how well you can see it there, but it was actually from the first Airbnb I stayed at when I went to do field work. And it was this wonderful visual rendering of, yeah, Tibet's over here, Brazil's over there, Colombia's over here, you know, all of the different places that you could experience if you came to stay in Jackson Heights. But people began to migrate. First, again, it was mostly unmarried or elderly married men that were migrating. Now, of course, it's whole families, it's women and men, it's unmarried people, it's married people, it's people who move because of marriage, either a paper marriage or a love marriage, if you will. And they began coming to New York in great part, again, because of continued sort of political instability in Nepal. Nepal's had 29 governments in as many years, but also this desire to experience some form of another place, especially among young people, to the point that to not leave is viewed as a failure. It's viewed as basically not completing the goals that your family might have set out for you. And in many ways, migration and remittances from New York fuel or still make possible village life in places like Mustang. And that's something that was said to me over and over, you know, during the course of my many trips for field work. You know, we need at least one person in New York to live in the village. And I think that, again, that's a really important dynamic for us to unpack and think about when we think about migration and what diaspora means. It's not a linear direction. But one of the things that people have also discovered as they've moved to New York is that they've gone from this context in which the depopulation of the Himalayan highlands is highly visible. Everybody can feel that the villages are emptying out, to places in New York City where they are a tiny drop in a South Asian or East Asian immigrant population that is very invisible to city government and to other forms of social services, for better and for worse. As I've mentioned, Jackson Heights is itself one of the most socially and linguistically diverse areas of the world. But just to give you sort of a number sense, there are about 13,000 people that live in Mustang, and about 2,500 of them are now in New York. So massive transformation at a local level. And that has also fueled other forms of migration to Mustang from other parts of Nepal, which is, again, a sort of social and economic dynamic that's worth talking about more. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about that. But I think what is important to note here is that belonging and a sense of belonging in a place like New York City is rather difficult when Himalayan and Tibetan New Yorkers who might identify for one of many reasons with the nation state of Nepal, with Tibet and Tibetanness, and therefore also in some ways with China, perhaps with Bhutan, perhaps with North India. Where on earth and where in the census do those kinds of designations fit? They really don't. And that's also part of the social and political invisibility that is at work here. And at the same time, as you know, new generations of young people, migrants, are growing up in New York, they are, of course, finding a sense of belonging in new ways by identifying as Asian American, by being identified or identifying themselves in New York public schools as people of color. And all of these layers of identity are unfolding in households and across kinship networks in very interesting and very complicated ways. And that's also part of what this book is about. So these are just some maps to kind of locate you. Mustang, again, is here on the left, and this is where Mustang is in the context of Nepal. It's like this thumb kind of jutting up into the Tibetan plateau. The picture on the right shows, again, this is from some of the Endangered Language Alliance work, and it shows just the diversity of languages in this region and sort of where Nepali and Tibetan and some of the Mustangi dialects. So I don't know if you can see it, but there's a dialect called Seke, which is, you know, it's a language that's only spoken in Mustang. And in New York City, it's basically contained within one Brooklyn apartment complex, where everybody in that Brooklyn apartment complex is from this one small region of Nepal. So that's also one of the interesting things that these stories of migration and belonging and care for each other tell us, is that, how people choose to live sociolinguistically is also a way, again, of marking territory in new territory. And this is something that, again, I've tried to pay attention to in my work. So I mentioned this idea of kora, of circumambulation before. That's the term at the bottom. Korwa on the top is a sort of larger umbrella concept in Tibetan. It's cyclic existence. It's what in Sanskrit is called samsara. And it's basically the turning of the wheel of life. It's the turning of kipo dupo, or happiness and suffering. And taken together, this idea of circumambulation, of literally moving along a circular path, and korwa of samsara, cyclic existence, all the work we do as sentient beings to survive and to thrive in this world, taken together, I think it tells us a lot. These concepts can tell us a lot about experiences of migration, diaspora, transnationalism, globalization, these other words that we use to gloss these experiences in English. And so in my book, The Ends of Kinship, I use this concept, or these two concepts rather, to form a kind of, it's somewhat awkward, but it's also important that it doesn't quite fit into English or Tibetan, of kora with an H, of migration, to kind of capture both of these ideas. On the one hand, the physical movement around the world or around a thing, and on the other hand, this sense of being and belonging together through our sentient travels as beings on this earth. This concept helps me to theorize patterns of movement, dynamics of world making, and attendant experiences of loss and wonder that shape migration and social change. And I do this also, I try to theorize with and through kora, also as a way of saying that we can build theory, not just out of concepts that come from continental philosophy. And I find this important, again, to the people that at its heart, I'm writing this book for. Younger generations of people from the Himalaya who are now living in America, who are struggling and adapting and doing this beautiful hard work of figuring out what it means to be from multiple places. And I think that, I do think that this concept of kora has legs beyond just Tibetan and Himalayan worldviews, that we can think about this in and through the social sciences. But it's also important that the concepts I use to talk about the people that I love and that undergird this work make sense to them too. And have a sense of meaning and resonance with them as well. So as I've come to understand migration and attendant markers of diaspora as kora, as a way of being in and moving through the world, it's helped me to illustrate patterns of mobility, which again, these are things that anthropologists pay attention to: patterns of mobility, processes of world making, networks of kin that stretch across these different places. Although, yes, it relates to these ideas of globalization, transnationalism, the worlding of people, things, and ideas, I feel like kora adds a layer of muscle memory to these kind of concepts. It is about embodiment. It is about physical movement, forms of ethical action, and a walking temporality, quite literally, that links the past and the present to possible futures. So The Ends of Kinship, the title of this book is not meant at all to signify something singular. It's not an end to the way of life in Mustang, far from it. It's rather about all the work that goes into connecting, tying up, shoring up relationships across time and space. And it's about the ways that these things fray, and they get tattered, and they get tired, and they get worn out over the course of migration. So The Ends of Kinship is not an end at all singular, but it's about the ways that people sustain and rebuild their connections, reweave their connections to each other. Migration depends and works on kinship, both. We follow the paths and the footsteps of those who have moved before us, right? Many of us in this room can tell that story. People call upon kinship networks to at once facilitate the logistics of migration, things like visas and plane tickets and jobs and apartments, but also to help each other through the less visible but equally challenging emotional transitions and cultural transitions that these kinds of changes engender. And so no matter where people from Mustang find themselves in the world, the social obligations that anchor kinship mean that one's first effort in any situation is to establish, through a recitation of lineage and place-based history, the names of villages, for example, through a telling of names and places, where and how you fit within this circle. And in Himalayan communities, as elsewhere, webs of relatedness keep people at once beholden to each other and endeared to each other. And I think that this says something about love and understanding and about home. This is another way of illustrating the ends of kinship. On this side, it says, we are the future of Mustang, so please love and care us. This is at a daycare in Mustang, a Montessori style daycare that's run by local women. Many of the young people at this daycare may have been born in New York City and then returned to Mustang for the period of time where otherwise their parents would have to be figuring out childcare in New York. Many times when especially their mothers are caring for other people as a way of making a living, other people's children as a way of making a living. But some of these are local kids who might not leave Mustang ever, might not leave Mustang until their teens or in their 20s. The picture on the right, though, also shows some of the hardship as well as the joy of the core of migration. This is a grandparent carrying a grandchild whose parents are working hard in New York as Uber drivers, as construction workers, as restaurateurs, as people working in supermarkets, living and dying under COVID, as nail workers, as nannies, and as second and third generations come, also as other kind of more quote unquote white collar workers as well. People like accountants, nurses, and home health aides are also a really common profession. But it takes a lot for an elderly woman to care for a child over time, when in a generation or two ago, she would have been the one being taken care of by a generation of people who were still around. And this is also one of the enduring issues that I work with in this book, namely the question of when, how, if, and will people return? And how will they walk this Kora over time? So this is one of the core relationships in the book. This is my Bai, my little brother Nawang. And he's wearing a shirt that means something very specific in the Tibetan political context. It says Lokto, a return, and that harkens to a return to Tibet, right? So a reoccupation, if you will, of Tibetan lands that are now essentially China's lands. But to wear this shirt in the context of Mustang, when Nawang has been living in New York since 2007, working in a fancy Indian restaurant in Curry Hill on the one hand, and running social enterprise work and research with me on the other, the question of when or how he will return to his mother, who remains in the village, is one that wears, he wears literally and figuratively on him, and many others do as well. So to write this book, I thought with a lot of anthropology, but I also thought with a lot of other sources. I thought with people like my dear friend, the poet Siringwang Modompa, people like Teju Cole writing about the Nigerian American experiences and other forms of diaspora. And I wrote with poets like Mary Oliver in mind. I've chosen to use the combination of fiction and ethnography to tell these stories for a range of reasons. Part of it is writerly. I knew I was going to be a writer before I knew I was going to be an anthropologist. And it was a way to finally write the book that I really wanted to write, as opposed to the book that I knew I needed to write for tenure, or the book that I wrote before tenure, but they told me not to write, but I wrote anyway. So the choice of fiction is once an aesthetic and a writerly choice. It's also an ethical choice. How do you tell really hard, really intimate stories as an ethnographer? Because it's part of the stories that you and those you work with believe need to be told, but do that in a way that doesn't implicate one particular family or one particular person in a way that could be easily revealed. But how do you get at social truth through fiction? And then how do you complement that and work with that as an ethnographer in spaces that also allow you to, as we are all told to do and must do, locate our own selves, locate our own positionality in this effort to storytell and to do justice to the stories that we are told. The book proceeds from birth to death and to transformation. So it sort of runs the Cora of the life cycle, or it runs through the cycle of samsara, if you will. And I've done that for a lot of strategic reasons, writerly reasons. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but it was also a logical organizing principle to start with birth and to end with death and rebirth. And by rebirth, not just meaning reincarnation in a strict Buddhist sense, but also how are we reborn in the context of migration? How does the recreation of home signify a reconstitution of life, a worlding again in these new ways? And in between, there are things like women and men and love and marriage and parents and children and education, and also the strategies that are used to make a life and make a livelihood and make papers in the context of immigrant New York. So I'd like to now just read you two brief excerpts. And in part, this is a way of also illustrating, sort of showing instead of telling what I've been talking about. To give you an example of the voice in both kinds of writing, to show you how they, I think, can work together, but also show you perhaps how they're also different. So the first, I'll read the nonfiction first, and then I'll read the fiction. The nonfiction is a section called the Ex-Monk Jeep Mafia. And it's from a book, it's from a chapter called Bringing Home the Trade, which is really about economic dynamics of migration and diaspora and how people make lives for themselves in and between these two different worlds. And I'm going to take a sip of water before I do that. The Ex-Monk Jeep Mafia. It is early autumn and high tourist season in Mustang, 2014. Monsoon has given way to open skies. Billowing cumulus clouds cast earthly shadows that echo shade. Dust is everywhere. The motorable road in Mustang has birthed a new kind of politics, one of fossil fuels and right-of-way, driving schedules, landslide repair, and ticket tariffs. Since an ongoing dispute between drivers from the village of Tsuk and those from Tsele has yet to be resolved, we walk the distance between these two villages. We sling our backpacks on at the Tsuk Jeep Depot, wrap our heads in scarves against the wind, and walk toward the Mustang Gate. At this spot, the mighty Kali Gandaki contracts from fingers to fist, its flow forced through a narrow arc punched through a sedimentary cliff of ochre rock. The river runs high. We cross a metal bridge, made for feet but passable for hooves, as well as motorcycles and mountain bike tires. 3 Jeeps are parked on the far side of the river. One is getting a bath. Its stiff metal doors yawn open. A young man with a K-pop hairdo and sun-bleached I Heart Nepal t-shirt is wiping down the back window. It seems a futile act, bespeaking pride and desperation by turns. Another young man reclines on the hood of his vehicle, eyes closed. Anyone going up? No one calls out. There are 6 of us, 2 foreigners and 4 locals. We hope that one of these Jeeps will ferry us to Tsele, where we will buy tickets for the local Jeep service to Gilling. No answer. Nawang tries again, closer this time to the napping driver. Hey, you going up? The driver stirs, but just enough to wave his hand and signal, no. Not our shift, the other driver answers. The rag in his hand is soaked in river water. Besides, we can't cut you a ticket down here. You have to walk up. Usually generous and good-natured, Nawang grumbles as we begin the vertical climb from the riverside to the village. They're just waiting for that big tourist group behind us because they'll be able to charge them 3,000 rupees for a 10-minute ride. We arrive, sweaty and with grit in our teeth, at the trekking lodge that doubles as a Jeep counter. I buy Cokes and orange Fanta for the group. We run our heads under the village water tap and wipe off the dust, now mud, from our faces. Nawang heads off to buy our passage to Gilling. He returns a few minutes later, clutching a thin pink piece of paper, our collective ticket. They wouldn't sell us a seat on the afternoon local, he says. They made us book a private Jeep. Said they only had room for 3 more people on the local, but really it's because they know we are here with 2 foreigners. Nawang motions to me and my student, Hannah, who has accompanied me on this trip to Low. With more tourists coming just behind, they can charge whatever they want. Nawang looks agitated for a moment, but then breaks into a smile. But it's okay. They tried to charge us 8,000 rupees. Then I started talking to the boy behind the counter. I thought I knew his face. And you know what? He was in the same class as my younger brother. His parents sent him off to Peno Rinpoche's monastery in South India when he was 12. Now he's 22 and an ex-monk, a talok. So anyway, we started talking and he charged us 5,000 only. Half of the drivers are talok, Kunzum responds. Given the work she's been doing to build a new community school in the village of Kami, she navigates this stretch of Mustang Highway often. Kunzum does not suffer fools, and she's had to negotiate continuously to get building supplies and provisions up valley. Fucking Dalog mafia, she mutters. They spend the first part of their lives earning merit and the second part of their lives swindling people out of money. But Didi, how else are they going to make a living? Nawang responds to Kunzum, Didi's older sister. His initial agitation has melted away, and he has gotten curious about this situation, its economic and its social implications. Although he's lived in New York for the better part of a decade, Nawang remains attuned to life in Mustang. Sure, they need to make money, and I don't really care if they leave the monastery. Half of them were sent off by their parents as soon as they could wipe their own behinds. Most don't know where they belong, but they've ended up back here. At least they got some education, she says, her voice softening. That ticket seller told me that most of the drivers have also tried and failed to go out, Nawang adds, out being a euphemism for migration abroad. He has 2 sisters in New York and a cousin in France. More are going to France these days. He tried twice to get a visa for the US and failed. Now he'll drive for others until he can afford his own Jeep or save enough money to build a house in Pokhara. After all those years in India, he doesn't really feel good in the mountains anymore. That's what happens when you get the abroad virus and you don't get the visa injection, says Kunzum. You feel sick wherever you are. So now I'm going to just read a little bit from a fictional chapter that is in a section, it's in a story called Gods and Demons. And this is really a story about a father and a son, and about their connection and relationship to each other. The father is a nakba, a householder priest, who's responsible for the well-being of the deities of the village and responsible for the well-being of people too in many ways. And his son, who has had training, done a 3-year meditation retreat, sort of ought to be his father's successor, but who lives without papers, without legal status in New York, can't go home, but also suffers from different forms of mental illness. And so this is at the very end of that story, and it takes place in Brooklyn in the summer of 2017. On a June morning, Yutok rises earlier than usual. Yutok is the son. He has told his friend Tashi that he can take the first shift at the Whole Foods greenhouse where they work. Tashi's aunt, the woman who raised him, is going through chemotherapy for stomach cancer, and it's Tashi's turn to accompany her to treatment. Yutok sits up in bed and performs his quiet morning puja, a whispered tumble of prayer, the pulsing snap of fingers. At the end, he sounds a long life prayer for Tashi's aunt, though this is not part of his usual practice. Yutok then slips a prescription bottle out from underneath his pillow and takes his medicine. It has been 4 years since his stay in the psychiatric unit at Bellevue Hospital, and months since he last tried to forego either his medications or his sessions with Dr. Rivera the man he has come to trust despite the cultural differences between them. To his credit, Dr. Rivera has learned to listen to Yutok. Their meetings are not about re-upping the RX and the quick exit. They have feeling. During one of their first outpatient appointments after the drama of that harrowing hospital admission, Dr. Rivera shared fragments of his own story. An immigrant who escaped war-torn El Salvador, he's the eldest of 5 siblings and the only one to make it through Mexico and eventually across the border under the guardianship of his mother's sister. I almost died during the crossing. He explained that he spent his adolescence working his way up North America's eastern edge to Nueva York, where he somehow made it through high school, then went on to college and medical school, Columbia, Sinai. Yutok did not know these places. He wondered if they were schools or countries. And your parents? Yutok asked. Brothers and sisters? Never saw them again, the doctor replied, looking long and lovingly at this fellow brown-skinned immigrant man. His honesty was arresting. Yutok offered, when I was working in Japan, I became lost mind there. They put me into a cell by myself, just a few days, but it made me wild, like Yutok pauses to remember the English word, like a jackal. He flashed on an image of that tawny, howling creature calling out in the Himalayan night. This bit of his truth was an offering in return for the doctor's story. Yutok thought about the cave where he completed his 3-year, 3-month, and 3-day retreat, and how even in the loneliest of moments, he still rested with the majesty of stars. Last year, when Yutok's mother, Sangmo, died of pneumonia during the winter spent in Kathmandu, after the earthquakes weakened her, Dr. Rivera held his crying patient in his arms. Jamyang, Yutok's younger brother, returned to Nepal to perform the acts an eldest son should have because Yutok could not leave, given his pending travel documents. He could not return to see his dying mother. Dr. Rivera recognized in himself Yutok's grief and anger. It was, if not transference, then a mirroring. Dr. Rivera was not a priest like Yutok's father, but he could still produce in Yutok a feeling of protection, of being protected. Yutok despised his medicines, even with the various shifts in dose and regimen, what Dr. Rivera called fine-tuning, and what Yutok experienced as shape-shifting sizes, colors, and aftertastes of pills. Yet his respect for this man who had shown him no judgment, but only care, exceeded his capacity to disobey. He took the pills, one might say, religiously. He prayed over the medicines every morning. He visualized them resting in the open palm of his yidam, which is a tutelary deity, peaceful in form. Yutok finishes his puja. The rest of the apartment sleeps. Yutok's cousin brother, Rapsang, breathes heavily as if he is blowing out a candle. Sherap, another villager from Dzong and a roommate, is curled up on the Tibetan carpet that doubles as a bed and a couch, 2 16-ounce Pabst Blue Ribbon cans on the floor beside him. Rapsang and Sherap work at Whole Foods too. Sherap got Yutok the job there about a year ago, and in turn, Yutok helped Tashi do the same. Yutok remembers how Sherap described this situation, the boss's love of Tibetans, Sherap had said, or people they think they are Tibetan. They say we are neat and clean. They think we treat all their expensive organic vegetables with loving kindness. Sometimes Sherap drinks too much, but Yutok enjoys his sense of humor. Yutok and Tashi started out as stock boys, but worked their way up to tending the rooftop greenhouses. They spend their days growing organic lettuces, baby carrots, tomatoes, peppers on a rooftop in Manhattan. Although the work can be difficult, many hours bent over, shuffling along rows of seedlings on your knees, he likes the act of cultivation. As he works, he sometimes imagined the honeyed sweetness of his family's barley, the taste of village buckwheat. Rows of wheatgrass under plastic tarps on the top of a 10-story building seem an odd simulacrum of what it means to be a farmer, but that is how things are now. Yutok gets dressed, drinks a glass of water, grabs his Metro card and keys, and leaves his apartment. He steps out of his building onto Newkirk Avenue, heading for the Q train. The street cleaners passed through only minutes ago. The asphalt is alive with steam. It is already hot. So thanks. I'll really stop there and take questions. Just two quick notes to say that I have been working on a project in Himalayan, New York, working with diaries, audio and visual diaries and other forms of narrative. And also working with one of the younger generations, if you will, someone who's from Mustang, who's now getting his PhD at Arizona State, and another grad student from UBC, on sort of the ways that COVID has changed some of the narratives around the purposes and the meanings and the outcomes of migration. So I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Thanks.
Sienna, thank you so much for this really wonderful talk. And I can't wait to read the book. I think I should offer by means of coordination, since we're doing this hybrid event, that Yeva Yusinit, my colleague in the back of the room, and I both have microphones. And so if you'd like to ask a question and you're in the room, we will pass a microphone to you. If you are here virtually and would like to ask a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. We can see you on the screen. And we will point to you and gesture in order to make it clear that we see you. So yeah, Riku.
Thanks, Doctor. Thank you, Sienna. That was really interesting. I really like one of the key conceptual moves you're making, which, as I see it, is a major contribution to social theory, which is to connect rites of passage in some ways with migration. And I think that's a very original conceptual move. And in my own research on mental illness, I've become kind of quite fascinated by the old classic Van Gennep's Rites of Passage, which was actually should be a much more celebrated text. But one of the key things in that, which all of us are familiar with, sort of Victor Turner and then Homi Bhabha, etc., was of liminality as kind of a threat. So I'm wondering, in this kind of circle that you're making, conceptually, it seems very promising. And I think in the fictional excerpt that you offered us, something like liminality, or what it is to be unsettled in that circle, is there. But I wonder if how you think through the gaps in the circle, or where a rite of passage is incomplete, or something like the notion of a broken circle. How you think that through in this very original connection between, I think, global migration with rites of passage is just phenomenal. I think across disciplines, it is highly relevant for even economists who think about remittance economies, etc. It's just a great connection to make. But I'm wondering how you think of the broken circle, or what in Van Gennep was liminality.
Thank you so much, Brigu, for that question. It gets to the heart of a lot of stuff that is important to me, both in terms of this book, but also my teaching. I actually teach a course with a colleague who is both trained in psychiatry, and also he grew up in Rhode Island, in fact, but he's also trained as a Hindu priest, Manish Mishra. We teach a whole class on rites of passage and at Dartmouth. And so both of those things have very much been on my mind as I've been writing this book. But I think that the moments of liminality where things break or fray or invert and might need to be put back together again are central, I would say, to how I've thought about the arc of each of the stories. And how and why I've thought about the narrative fiction chapters as fragments or mosaics that don't fit perfectly together. I think that in many ways, friends and colleagues and people I consider family from Mustang are often living the liminality kind of all the time. And yet what pulls them out of that are these moments of routine and routine ways to be together. So the physical markings by Cora at the beginnings and ends of each day, which of course in New York City is not so possible. And so there it's become the virtual circling of voice memos through WeChat and other channels like that, digital platforms that allow people to check in with each other at those same kind of markers of the beginnings and the ends of the days. But being betwixt and between is, such a central part, I think, of what migration is about. And in many ways, it's also a central part of what fieldwork is about, what doing this particular form of anthropology is about. And not that they're analogous experiences at all. They're obviously quite different, but yeah, in many ways, the liminal drives the narrative, if that helps.
Thank you. And it's really great that you teach a class on rites of passage.
Yeah, it's really fun. Yeah.
I'm going to the next room because there's also a talk, but not because I'm offended by the fact that you gave a Buddhist answer to a Hindu question. Thank you.
I love it.
Questions?
Thank you so much for the talk. That was it's really interesting, and the reading of the excerpts sort of almost transport you to a place that one probably has not been to. But that was really good. I'm wondering more specifically how belonging vis-a-vis ethnicity, ethnic politics plays out, particularly keeping in mind. You talk about the geopolitical forces, nation states, documents. So sort of, how does this dynamic between this desire to kind of secure formal recognition, given the sort of the multi sort of nation geopolitical factors, how does that play out with sort of more everyday actions that are embedded? Through rituals and language. Yeah. That makes sense. Thank you.
It does make sense, and it's a great question. It plays out in very complicated ways. So I didn't talk much about this in the talk, but to sort of answer with an example or a story, right? It's possible for someone from Mustang to travel to the States on their Nepali passport, to apply for political asylum as a Tibetan refugee once they get here, to get that asylum status and therefore have their US green card or eventually their US passport when it says, on the green card, how it says country of origin or whatever it is, birth country or however it's labeled, say China, right? And have none of those actually capture where they're from or who they, in that sense, really are. And yet to have each of those moments of inscripting the right to be somewhere be dependent or contingent on these ways of drawing connections and disconnections between who you really are, if I can say that, and who you also are. Right. And so it isn't a stretch for a person from Mustang to say that they are culturally Tibetan, even as it might not be true in a strict sense that they are directly persecuted by the Chinese, and therefore that is why they need asylum status, right? But it is also equally, true and complex that in that household, there will be fierce debates or spaces of silence that don't get addressed about which languages are being spoken and why to kids, and whether or not they are choosing to speak Loke, which is the Tibetan variant that's spoken in Mustang, or they're speaking Nepali because, and literally, parents will say this, but Nepal is our country, even though, again, they have an American passport, right? And obviously are very committed to and pay taxes in and all of that stuff, this country. Or whether they should be speaking and teaching their children classical Tibetan, because it's a way in a sense of elevating their sense of Tibetanness, but also at the same time kind of making it uniform, getting rid of, in a sense, the diversity of experience that also marks what it means to be from this village in Mustang, as opposed to sort of this generic sensibility of being an exiled Tibetan. So it plays out in all of those micro and macro ways. And again, it's an area that people feel often quite conflicted intergenerationally as well.
Oh, okay. So perhaps we can switch to Zoom and then we can return to the room. This is our colleague, Kate Mason. Kate, are you able to, thank you, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Sorry I wasn't able to be there. I had some childcare issues, but I really enjoyed your talk and really look forward to reading your book as well. And I had two questions that are kind of different from each other, but come off of some of the other questions that have been asked. One of them follows a little on what you were just talking about with regards to the relationship of the younger generation from Mustang with the other immigrants in their neighborhoods. You kind of point to this a little in your fictionalized account about Dr. Rivera and whatnot. But as a China scholar, I'm particularly interested in their relationship with their East Asian neighbors and the degree to which they may or may not develop sort of different perspectives on the politics of Tibet and China and all the rest of it while they're there, and whether that figures into their relationships when they return or with their family. Just very curious about that. And then the second question has to do with the fiction ethnography relationship, which I'm really interested to read about in your book, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot as well. And I often have a lot more trouble than I think I should, explaining to students what exactly the difference is sometimes between ethnography and fiction. And maybe that would sound horrifying to some of my colleagues in other social sciences, but there's obviously a fine line sometimes. And so I wonder if you could just speak more to how it is you're thinking about those as two distinct things, and why you decided to include both in a sort of separate sections in your book, which I find to be a really interesting choice. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kate. And I actually really would love to hear more about your COVID diary work as well, because I think there might be some interesting parallels. I'm right that you've been doing some stuff like that, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I'd love to talk about that too.
Yeah. So the question about China and sort of the ways that people come to, no worries. Oh, hello. Should I just go for it? Okay, now it's better. So the relationship between sort of Tibetanness and China once people move to New York is indeed quite interesting. And as people circulate also between Nepal and New York, in some instances, I've seen it sort of drive a different form of mutual recognition and understanding. And even if I dare use this word, compassion, when people from different parts of China encounter people from, let's say, Mustang in the context of their work lives in New York, and realize that they actually, what they do share is oppression under capitalism, and some of the things that unite elements of their immigrant lives in the city. I think that so I've seen that happen, and I've seen friendships form that probably would have had a harder time forming for all sorts of reasons if they were occurring back in an Asian context. But I have also seen, to use a COVID example, I have definitely seen a lot of politics getting kind of more entrenched in certain ways, and that has occurred, ironically, again, in a really somewhat dramatic way through COVID, where some of my friends and colleagues from Mustang, who may also have family in Tibet proper, have viewed COVID through the same conspiratorial lens that someone like Trump has with respect to what happened in China and why, and how it is that, this virus has spread around the world and done all the damage that it has. And so those are really interesting conversations to navigate, to try to kind of talk through the senses of misinformation and the xenophobia that are there, but also to try to understand that, well, I'm thinking of one particular example of my very close friend whose family I lived with in Mustang. She's from Tibet, originally from Shigatse, and her brother-in-law died of COVID in their apartment in New York City in April 2020. But she also has had, family members who died during the Cultural Revolution. And she's like trying to make sense of all of this data that she's getting, often not from great sources, right? And to try to unpack that with her was really complicated. She was very quick to judge or to kind of revert into a corner of belonging, even as she and an ethnically Chinese person standing next to her on a subway ramp might be equally subject to racism from a non-Asian at that moment, right? And so that COVID has sort of thrown loops into a lot of this. But I think one of the ways that people still are wrestling with the Tibet-China question has to do with, the ways that a lot of folks from Mustang talk about this is to say, and the verb they use literally is to eat. So they say, well, China ate Tibet. There's no question about that. They politically ate Tibet, but now they don't have to politically eat us in northern Nepal because they've already economically eaten us. And that's what's going to sort of continue to drive our lives. So they may not take pictures of the Dalai Lama away from us, but they dominate our economy and they're changing our food systems and, all of these other things. So that's one of the other ways that they talk about that. The fiction ethnography question, I could talk about for a really long time, but I won't. I think that for me, part of the choice to do this mirroring, and so the book is structured where essentially the short story comes first, and then an ethnographic chapter follows. And in a sense, the fiction allows for a full arc of a narrative. It allows for a beginning, a middle, and an end. And ethnography, I think, almost by default, but I think if you're doing it in a way that is attuned to its always fragmentary and imperfect nature, it's never going to have a perfectly neat beginning, middle, or end. But we have to do something with all of that. And so the combination of the two have allowed me to kind of feel like I'm doing justice to some senses of the fullness of the stories to which I've been entrusted, but also right into all of this still, these jarring points of liminality, of connection, of disconnection, and to locate myself more directly. Obviously I'm in the fiction because I wrote it, but I'm not in the fiction in the same way that I'm in the ethnography, in terms of, like in the excerpt I read, sort of placing the way that me being there with a student from Dartmouth actually changes the dynamics, right? And that's also part of what ethnography needs to be attentive to in some way. So that's also why I felt for a project like this, I needed or wanted both.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for the talk, which I really enjoyed. Among other reasons why I enjoyed the talk so much is I'm teaching a new class next semester on fiction and ethnography, actually.
Wow.
So I'd actually love to talk to you more about that.
I have
some
a
other
teaching
time.
website for the book.
Great, I'd love to have, I'll go look for it, thank you. But one of the other reasons I liked the talk is that it was it both echoed and also was different in ways I'm going to ask you about in a minute. Some of my own research. So I work in Mexico, and one of the communities I work in is also a very diasporic community. The place they land in the United States is LA rather than New York City, but in so many ways, so many things were familiar. The linguistic diversity, the kind of visibility versus invisibility. So these people are indigenous, they speak an indigenous language. the depopulation is very visible there. I mean, half the town lives in LA, but that is matched with an invisibility in the United States, where they're at best recognized as Mexican, never as indigenous, and sometimes not even as that, right? So that tension I really enjoyed a lot. However, the difference really was that I think I was reflecting on the way, if I had told this story and the way I think people themselves tell this story, something that would be much more salient, has come out a little bit in the questions, but was not so present in your narrative, has to do with internal divisions, factionalism, disputes over things like language socialization, modernization, relationship to the Mexican state, all kinds of other things that were not so salient in your narrative. And I got to thinking about how both, my own ethnography, other ethnography that's been written about this community has really stressed the factionalism and the importance of the factionalism. And I think that's also part of the narrative of the people that they themselves, who also, they have blogs, they have websites, so they're telling their own story. It's not just up to us as ethnographers to tell their story, which I guess for me raises this question for me, which is, where is that sort of like in terms of your story or your understanding of Mustang in a diasporic context? Where are those things? Where is like friction, difference, division, generational division, et cetera? Where is that kind of in your narrative? But there's a second question, which is like, how does the relative absence or presence of those themes in your narrative, how does that stand in relationship to how people themselves tell their story, right? I mean, so is this part of your narrative that's not so present? Is that part of their narrative that you're in part echoing? How do you think about the relationship between those two, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And those are great questions. There's a lot of friction in the book, even if it didn't come out so much in sort of the story that I told about it. And in fact, the friction is one of the reasons driving the fiction, if that makes sense. It felt for me, from my own positionality, like it was like the fiction became a vehicle for talking about points of friction that ethnographically would have been much more difficult to do. There is friction in, Kunzum saying, oh, the fucking Jeep Mafia, and getting angry at different points at the ways that she's treated there as a powerful single woman. I mean, I could give other examples, but the fiction allowed for me to talk about, again, some of these key areas of contestation or conflict, especially intergenerational, but also in a sense, the things that happen with cultural change, things that relate to gender and sexuality, for example, things that relate to this tug and desire to let go of guilt about not going home or not going back. Those are things that felt like I could do a better job of caring for those dynamics by writing about them through fiction than only in the ethnography. They do appear in the ethnography too, but in terms of other forms of self-representations, there are a number of them, but there also, I hope there will continue to be more. One of my motivations for doing the work with the Endangered Language Alliance has actually been because it's been a mode of video and audio storytelling about migration experience in local and indigenous Himalayan and Tibetan languages that are not, I've learned from those narratives, but they're not my narratives. They've formed part of a corpus that is now actually being shared on YouTube among and between the communities as a way of representing in a different sense what they're going through. And that itself has also generated friction. So for instance, there's a young woman from Mustang who does one of these videos in this Voices of the Himalaya project. And she came from Mustang when she was in the 5th grade, didn't speak English at all, got put into a really special elementary and middle school for new immigrant kids who didn't speak English. By the time she was getting into high school, she was, competitive in one of the best sort of hardest to get into whatever public high schools in New York. And she got a Gates scholarship to go to Hampshire and then went on to Columbia. But in her video, she talks about, she says, "Ma feminist theory dangie." I'm studying feminist theory, right? And she does all this code switching and she uses like and all this stuff. And the haters that came through on the comments on that from her own community was really palpable. And it was, again, because there was this sense that she was somehow too something else or too hybrid. Whereas this other young woman, the same age as her, who, you know, had, and she had Tibetan dress, but she also had like super fancy nails and lots of makeup, and she's very beautiful. And then this other young Tibetan woman, her same age, who did another video, and she had no makeup, looked very plain, with looked a lot more modest in certain senses, had a Bucknell t-shirt on, like, you know, and she spoke without as much code switching, and she spoke in a kind of standard or elevated Tibetan, and all the comments were about how wonderful she was, right? And so that's just one example of sort of some of those dynamics at work. But yeah, you know, the conflict is real, and it's there. And having young people who can, like the two people I just described, they've read the book. And I think one of the things that's been valuable for them is to sort of see ways of talking about conflict at some level in the stories that then, you know, they can think about how they want to talk about it on their own terms, but also have it at some level validated that it's okay to talk about some of this conflict, because otherwise it just sort of flies around WeChat and you know, gets people nervous, but there's not a lot of outlet for it that's perhaps about, well, I'm going to tell this story about myself or about my community. So I hope that answers.
So we are almost out of time, but we do have time for one more question.
Oh, hi, I'm a student from RISD, which is the art college next to this. I'm currently a sophomore in ceramics major. And I'm from China, and I also grew up in China. And today, the reason why I came to this forum is because I feel like the curriculum and the courses in RISD is a little boring, and I want to get to know more, and I want to see what like brown campus is like. So I came here, and I think I made a really good decision because I learned so much from your talk, and it just like made me realize how ignorant and like narrow my views were. And it also raises lots of questions for myself, and also it raises so many questions and like confusions, because I've also been through lots of changes during the sorry, I get excited during the COVID. And also, like, I started to question the institute and like structures. And so I really appreciate your talk. And I think the questions maybe you and the organizer for this event can answer would be like, I wonder, as an international student, like, is there any, like, what ways we can get involved into like, or participate in the events, or like take courses in the events like this? Because yeah, I think I'm really eager just to know more about this world and what is happening actually. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for being so brave just now. And I can't answer because I don't teach here. I'd love to, but I don't teach here. I can't answer the questions about sort of how might you get better involved, but I know there are a number of people in the room who can help connect you for other talks. But I think the question you're asking also is about, you know, finding new forms of community and connection and continuing to open your mind, and that, you know, that is what college is about, right? Hopefully, not to sound like a brochure. And it's great that you took a break from your art form, right, in order to come and think in a different way about the world. And I know, and I respect that for many Chinese citizens or people who have grown up hearing one set of things about Tibet or the Himalaya, that it's hard sometimes to try to imagine something else. So thank you very much for your openness to listen. Yeah.
Thank you, Sienna, and thank you everyone for coming.